Dealerships not only in the United States, but around the entire world are sounding the alarm, and today we're going to be talking about it. Now remember that my course, the Car Sharing Masterclass, is on sale until January 31st. You can use the code NEWYEAR2024 to get $150 off your purchase. The link to that is down in the description below. Now, we have had two somewhat major players in the automotive space call it quits just this month, and this could be a bad omen for what is to come in the automotive industry in 2024. The first of these two companies is Vroom. Now, if you found my videos from my Carvana series I did about a year ago, chances are you probably have heard of the company Vroom. Vroom, like Carvana, is an online vehicle retailer. Their entire business model is to buy and sell cars 100% online, very similar to Carvana, and probably to no surprise, this business model really thrived during the pandemic. Now, I wouldn't say that Vroom blew up like Carvana did during the pandemic. Carvana became a multi-billion-dollar company what felt like overnight, and while this didn't really apply to Vroom, they certainly did excel during this period of time. At the time, there were really three major players in the online dealership model, with Carvana being the biggest, and Vroom and Shift trailing behind. You may remember that Shift last year announced that they were filing for bankruptcy and ceasing operations, and now Vroom has done the same. And according to Vroom, they will discontinue its e-commerce operations and wind down their used vehicle dealership business, eliminating about 800 jobs. And the reasoning behind this that Vroom has stated is because they were unable to raise enough capital in order to keep their operations going. Vroom will be selling their current inventory wholesale, and their captive finance unit, United Auto Credit Corp, will continue to serve third-party customers, while their other company, CarStory, which is an AI-powered analytics and auto retail digital service platform, will also still be in operation. Now, between Shift going bankrupt last year and Carvana being on the brink of bankruptcy in years past, I feel like I have made different variations of this exact same video before.
I think I've seen this film before, and I didn't like the ending.
Now, in my opinion, the closure of Shift really could be indicative of a few key things. Number one is the car market is absolutely changing. That's a fact, and we all know it. Car prices, high interest rates, skeptical buyers. This is absolutely playing a role in how companies like Vroom are succeeding or failing. But truthfully, I think that there are two other factors that are playing a much larger role, and these are factors that aren't oftentimes talked about in the context of the car market. And one of those reasons is the fact that the online dealership model, so models like Carvana, Vroom, and Shift, this is a flawed business model. When one player in this space fails, we can look at that business and say, okay, they just weren't cut up for success. But when all three major players in this space have either filed for bankruptcy, announced bankruptcy, or were on the brink of bankruptcy, we have to look at the business model in a whole and ask ourselves, does this idea really have legs? Now, these are just my thoughts as someone who spends a lot of time in this space. But truthfully, I'm not entirely convinced that the majority of car buyers want a 100% online car buying experience. We all hear stats about how people prefer to buy cars online. There's been dozens of them, but I pulled this study from Q1 of last year from the McKinsey & Company, which is a very reputable consulting firm, and the consensus of this study was that buying cars online is where the car market is trending. And while I do think that this could be the case with new cars, it's sort of the Tesla effect. I think Tesla has done an exceptional job at really making the online car buying process easy and not daunting, which I think is a really incredible feat, because getting someone to spend anywhere between 40 and 100 grand for a car that they haven't even seen is no easy task. But I don't believe that this translates to used cars in the same way, and I don't think it ever has. And I think that the problem with many of these statistics and studies that we see is that whenever we talk about buying a used car online, it's oftentimes framed in comparison to buying a car at a dealership. And let's face it, dealerships are the worst, and I sometimes theorize that while people like the idea of being able to buy a car online without going to a dealership, without having to deal with the salesperson, whenever push comes to shove, if somebody needs to buy a used car, they are going to go to a dealer because it's what they're comfortable doing, and in most cases for a used car, it's what makes sense. There is also the valid argument of what is buying a car online. Buying a car online is a spectrum, and this is something that isn't talked about either. According to a study done last year, 90% of car buyers would prefer to have a car buying process that starts online. And truthfully, I think we can all agree on that. In fact, I'm a bit surprised that that number isn't higher. I think I can speak for many customers whenever I say that we want to be able to find the car that we want to buy online. We even want to be able to verify that this is the right car online, and in an ideal world, we would like to be able to get an idea of financing online as well. But I think many buyers, including myself, would also like to be able to go to the dealership and look at the car before purchasing it, and maybe even test driving it. And I think that this is one of the biggest problems with business models like Vroom, is that it's really an all or nothing strategy. And I think that this is one of the reasons why, at least when it comes to the context of online car dealerships, Carvana Carvana has been faring the best across these three businesses because Carvana in many ways can be viewed as somewhat of a hybrid model. Based off of how the car market has trended post-pandemic, I'm just not convinced that 100% online car sales is the solution, and instead a car buying process that begins online with transparent pricing and a hybrid of an in-person and online experience is. But truthfully, the third factor here is one of the biggest reasons why I think that companies like Vroom just simply aren't succeeding. And this is the shift that we're seeing in startup culture today in 2024. Now, I've spoken about this before on my channel, specifically in the context of Carvana, but I never really hear about this being discussed in the context of other dealerships or in the automotive industry as a whole. But startup culture has changed, and this is absolutely having an effect on these companies that are considered tech companies within the automotive industry. Vroom was founded in 2012, which was right at the peak of prime time for startups. From the mid-2000s really up until a year or two ago, startups were the thing. Money was cheap, tech was hot, and industry disruptors were all the rage. This was the time where tech startups were popping up every week, dozens of them, and they would stick around forever, go public, and make a ton of revenue despite the fact that they had no profitability. And this was in large part due to the fact that investors were incredibly eager. You could get really cheap money and a bit of the right place at the right time. In recent years, there's been a ton of articles and studies talking about how the tides have turned with startups and how nowadays there's just a higher threshold of what makes a startup successful. And as a result, there's a lot of startups that are filing for bankruptcy or ceasing operations. And this is in large part due to the fact that it's just harder to raise money today than it was 10 years ago. But one particular article that I found really interesting about this was talking about how startups really subsidized the millennial lifestyle throughout the 2010s. Back in the early 2010s, everything was so cheap in the tech world, from Ubers to food delivery, Airbnb, subscriptions. Back then, it was extremely cheap for all of these luxuries that today you have to pay a really high premium price for. This was in an effort for these startups to be able to get as many customers as possible because customer base, subscriber base, orders or rides, these figures were more important than actual profitability of that customer base. Or in the case of companies like Vroom, car sales. But today, profitability matters significantly more, and it's not just a matter of how many customers you can get through the door and at what cost. It's instead how much money can you make off of those individual customers. I think that this is a huge factor with companies like Vroom, and I think that this isn't really talked about enough. Sure, Vroom failed because the car market shifted. I'm sure if the car market retained its 2021 levels, Vroom would probably have been able to succeed. But more importantly, Vroom died because their business model was unsustainable and unprofitable, and they couldn't continue to raise capital in order to keep the business going. And this isn't a Vroom-specific problem, and while you don't really see this a ton in the automotive industry, you do see it a lot in tech and startups. You're seeing these once successful companies now shuttering their doors because they simply can't raise enough funds, because investors aren't interested in investing in these companies like they once were. And so while I do think that the closure of Vroom is definitely indicative of something shifting in the car market, I don't think that it's indicative of anything that we didn't already know. And instead, I think that this is once again another domino falling for the economy as a whole and the tech industry that was once a massive bubble, where I guess technically could still be considered a bubble as it hasn't really burst yet. But the good news is that I do think that this will have a positive impact on the car market as a whole, because as Vroom sells off their inventory, that will hopefully mean that car prices will go down even more. Though I don't think it will lead to a huge crash of car prices either. Now on to the second dealership. Guangdong's Yongyao Group, a Chinese automaker with 80 dealerships, just announced their collapse this month. And I apologize in advance for what I assume is going to be mispronunciation on that dealership group. I did look up how to pronounce it, but it was still a bit unclear. And according to a Bloomberg article, high sales targets set by automakers are pressuring them to get cars out the door, while a slowing Chinese economy has seen many customers delaying purchases in the hope of dealer discounts. Now, you may be thinking, why does this matter to the American viewers or people that are really only interested in the American car market? And I believe that it matters is because China is becoming a growing player in the automotive market. And whenever we look at the global economy, looking at a major player like China in any regard and seeing slowdowns is never a good thing for the US economy. And it seems as though the Chinese car market is struggling with many things that the US car market has been struggling with as well. And so we have to ask ourselves, is what is happening to this Chinese dealership group? Is it a precursor to what could happen to some US dealership groups as well? And to that, I think we'll just have to see. Like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it. So make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video.